SqSp have sponsored part of this video and I thank them for it.
Okay, it's freezing cold, but I'm here in Paderborn, Germany, outside the Heinz Nixdorf Museum to come and see the first internet celebrity the world ever saw. First streaming internet celebrity. So let's get inside, let's get warm, take a look.
Now, this museum is absolutely brimming with incredible things. It claims to be the largest computer museum in the world, and there's certainly enough here to keep you occupied for days. However, I only had a few hours and a mission to find something that most people would probably overlook.
So it's easy to get distracted in here, there's a lot to see, but after walking around a bit, I finally found it. Here it is. It's a coffee pot.
But this wasn't the original location of this fairly innocuous looking coffee pot. It's not even the right country.
It was here, at the new museum site at the University of Cambridge.
This building then was the original location of what would be known as the Trojan Room Coffee Pot, where the former computer lab was housed in the Arup building, built in 1969 specifically to house the lab. Nowadays it's called the David Attenborough Building and is a hub for biodiversity and conservation. So to chart its story, we need to first venture to the new computer lab housed in the William Gates Building, a short journey to the west of Cambridge, where I'm meeting Quentin Stafford-Fraser, one of the men responsible for creating this global sensation. Now, this might be a more modern building, but Quentin was keen to show me a lot of interesting old tech that has made its way here, from parts of EDSAC2 to an entire relic cupboard filled with vintage treasure. Naturally, I was more than happy to take a look before sitting down and delving into the story.
Hello, so I'm Quentin Stafford-Fraser, and we are in now technically the Department of Computer Science and Technology in the University of Cambridge, but it's always been known as the Computer Lab to those of us who've been here for a long time. And I've been here on and off for a very long time because I was an undergraduate student here, and then I did a PhD, and I worked for the lab, and then I came and did some research here. So on and off, I've been in the department for a long time, but it wasn't always in this building. Before that, we were in an older building in the centre of Cambridge, which had been around for quite a long time and was really not a very beautiful building. It was a very impractical building. It was a tower that had won lots of architectural awards, but let the rain in. And we were in a research group that was spread over several floors in this tower, and we were working on things like multimedia over computer networks. This was back in the early 90s, and it wasn't really clear just how computer networks would do at transmitting multimedia. Could we do broadcast quality television over a computer network? That was something that really was quite challenging at the time. The particular research group I was in was looking at various different forms of computer networks. It was back when Ethernet was just starting to take off, but it certainly wasn't clear that Ethernet was going to be the standard that won. And so we were looking at ATM networks. That's nothing to do with cash machines. That is asynchronous transfer mode, which is a different way of sending packets of information over the networks. And it has some real advantages if what you are doing is, say, a stream of video. So we were looking into this, and there were various people doing their PhDs. I was just a research assistant at the time, but they were doing their PhDs into things like how you might store video on disks, how you might retrieve video, large corpuses of video from disks, how you might transmit it over the network and be able to guarantee a certain amount of quality. and so on. So we had quite a lot of kit hanging around, things like cameras and frame grabber cards and discs you could store things on. And so there was a lot of this multimedia kit available to us, which actually wouldn't generally have been there for other people. So this group consisted of quite a few people, and many of us worked in a single room that was called the Trojan room. We had a habit of naming computers, big computers, after sort of various classical references at the time. So there was the Titan and the Trojan and things. We were in the Trojan room. Several of us were literally in that room, but some people were in rooms across the corridor or up a flight or two of stairs, and so on. One thing we had in common, though, was we all shared this coffee filter machine. There wasn't very good coffee in the department at all. In fact, the coffee in the department was pretty appalling. We had marginally better coffee, which we had from just a very standard, cheap filter machine. But even that was only really drinkable at all if you got to it while it was fresh. Now that was nice and easy for me because I sat right next to the coffee machine, and so I always got fresh coffee. I always knew when it was full. But not everybody in the group did, and they would often come down 3 flights of stairs only to discover that the coffee pot was empty or that it had been sitting there for a long time. And so a friend and I decided we could do something to make the situation more equable. Coffee has always been a very important part of computer science research. You have to give programmers a good stream of coffee to keep them working productively. And this dates back from the days when often to get time on the mainframe you would be up in the middle of the night, and so coffee was even more important. We didn't have that problem generally. So what we did was we found a camera, this camera actually, which was left over from one of our previous experiments, and we connected it to one of the special purpose computers we'd been using for our network research. Now, back in the day, a camera that you could connect to a computer was a very rare and a very expensive thing, so it was pure fluke that we happened to have such things lying around and available to us. And we gripped it in a kind of retort stand and pointed it at the coffee pot. And I wrote a bit of software that, with my friend Paul Jardetsky, he wrote the server side, the bit that captured the images. And I wrote a little client program which could display in the corner of your screen a picture of the coffee pot. And what that meant was that if you didn't sit right next to it, you could just glance down at the corner of your screen and immediately see whether it was worth going down 3 flights of stairs because there was any coffee in the pot or not. And if you watched it, you could even get an idea of, whether it was fresh or not. You could wait until someone else had done the hard work of filling it up, and then you could run down and get fresh coffee.
This original application was called SqSp, running on MIT's X window system and spurting out grainy 8-bit monochrome images 3 times a minute. Although they would quickly become 768 by 576 images to fully test the network, which is quite a big image in those days. But really, this was the first instance of a stream, or webcam if you like, running over a network, and it was enough to be featured in a Communications Week article in January 1992 after columnist Bob Metcalf visited the lab. He wrote, "Quentin and Paul wrote SqSp so that while sitting at their networked workstations, they can see the coffee pot shared with colleagues in the lab's office tower. The computer laboratory is littered with cheap video cameras as a result of its Pandora project. They commandeered a spare camera and aimed it at the coffee pot from a rack-mounted video frame-grabbing 68020 server." SqSp is the best network appliance hack I've heard about since the simple network management protocol managed toaster demonstrated at Interop a year ago. We can talk about that at a different time. But what we will talk about is sponsor Squarespace. Although having a website was luxurious in the 90s, you know you need one now. Even if you don't have a webcam, you might have a video-based business, and using Blueprint AI is very easy to set up a site. Sickeningly so. No reams of typing out HTML and style sheets, just a few clicks, and you're done. Optimized for SEO and mobile, ready to go. Just head to Squarespace to get started, and then when you're ready, squarespace.com/nostalgianerd to get 10% off a website or domain.
I think the software would have been written in C, probably, and the first version would have been using libraries that we had built for our other multimedia work. But most of us were using Hewlett-Packard workstations. It was a project that was sponsored by Hewlett-Packard at the time, and so they would have been running HPUX, I think, the Hewlett-Packard version of Unix. And but the computers that this was actually connected to and the things we were doing research on were running our own operating system called Atmos, because we were looking at asynchronous transfer mode, ATM networks, so Atmos was the name of the operating system. But we could also run it on a variety of other hardware, like an Acorn Archimedes. And it was very, very basic as video goes. It was refreshed, I think, about 3 times a minute, but that was fine because the coffee pot filled up very slowly. And it turned out this was exceedingly useful, and everybody in the group ran this, even it was far more useful than anything else I did while I was working in that group. And so this was a camera that was connected to a network, and a server was capturing the images from the camera and making them available to other people on the network. But this was before the World Wide Web, so it was actually about the same time as the web was starting.
Soon after Bob Metcalfe's visit, there were suggestions of an X-sandwich van and X-printer output tray app, but the hardware for the original frame grabber would actually die before anything else had a chance of life. However, in March 93, the NCSA Mosaic browser incorporated a few more features that made things a little more interesting, and so Quentin, along with Daniel Gordon and Martin Johnson, looked at opening up the coffee pot to more than just the computer lab.
The early web browsers could only display text. You could do a few things like change the color of the text or the size of the text or lay it out in different ways, but you couldn't, for example, include images. But a couple of years later, about 18 months later, in 1993, web browsers started to get the image tag. They got the ability to display images, and people would use them to put the logo of their organization or the crest of their university or even a picture of their results or sometimes even a picture of their girlfriend, but usually fairly static images on what in general were very static pages at the time. So a friend and I were talking about this, and we wondered what would happen if, when the browser goes to the server and says, could I have this image to go in my web page? Suppose the server didn't give back the same thing every time. We didn't know what would happen. The whole set of caching directives that are built into HTTP and HTML now didn't exist back then, so we really weren't sure what would happen. And we thought, where have we got a stream of constantly changing images that we could do some experiments with? Oh, well, how about the coffee pot? And so a couple of my friends modified this to capture the image periodically and make it available over this new thing called HTTP. That meant that you didn't have to run my special software anymore. You could use one of these newfangled web browsers, and you didn't have to be running our special networking stack, which understood the ATM networking protocols. You could just use an ordinary PC, and so using a web browser, you could see how much coffee there was available in our coffee pot.
By November of 93, the system, armed with a new frame grabber and running from an Acorn Archimedes 310, the very same but can now be seen in the lobby of the William Gates building, got to work pumping out an image every 3 seconds on this new glorious superhighway. Although actually, given the constraints of most people's internet connection, the image was actually a lower resolution than the original internal network.
Up until that point, very few people had seen live images from anywhere else in the world. And it's very easy to forget this now when we can all do it from our phones. But if you saw live TV from somewhere back then, it was because the BBC or some big broadcasting company had taken an enormous outside broadcast van and had parked it outside Wimbledon or somewhere and were streaming with lots of staff with big cameras. Whereas here, after browsing through lots of static pages on the web, you might suddenly stumble across this little square which was a live image of a part of the world you had never been to and probably never would go to, but it was you didn't know when you went to that page what you would see when you got there. And so it was this little window into a reality somewhere else. And I don't want to make this sound bigger than it was, but that's why it was unusual. Also, there really weren't very many web pages on the web at the time, and the fact that this was expensive and complicated kit, which we were using for something as trivial as monitoring a £20 coffee filter machine had a bit of wackiness about it that I think captured people's attention at the time. One of the first TV crews that came to visit us came from Japan, and actually this was the other thing I mentioned, that actually it became a global thing, whereas it hadn't been in the past. And we realized, the first time we really realized this was when we got emails from somebody complaining that he had tried to look at our webpage and all he saw was a black square. And it took us a while to click that his email address was in Australia. And, we didn't get that much email from other parts of the world at the time. And so whenever he went to look at it, we were all in bed and the lights were off. So one of the first things we actually had to do was get an angle-poised lamp pointing at this thing so that it was permanently illuminated, not because we needed that for the coffee, but because of all the people who wanted to look at the coffee pot in the middle of the night. And we had people turning up. I remember one couple who turned up at Cambridge Tourist Information asking if they could see this coffee pot camera. And the tourist information people who were just down the road worked out that it was something to do with computers. And so they said, well, there's a computing department just up the road. You could go and ask them. And so sure enough, they came. I forget where they were visiting from. I think it was the States. And so they were able to come and have a cup of coffee from the coffee pot that they had only seen previously from thousands of miles away. So it was quite fun.
And despite the basic nature of its webpage and indeed the subject matter itself, this humble little coffee pot really did capture attention around the globe. Japan, as you might expect being a culture that quickly adopted webcams, jumped on the chance to go and film this piece of developing history. So, the middle of '94 saw not just Cambridge's coffee pot, but also a young Quentin Stafford-Fraser himself broadcast into Japanese households. Here you can see the original camera at work, along with the then coffee pot sitting on a rather British floral tray. Quentin then shows the number of visits per week increasing fairly rapidly on this graph. With the coffee pot technically becoming the most visited tourist attraction in the region, Anglia News would feature a segment in 1996.
A coffee pot. Interest is such that a camera is permanently trained on the device so its every condition can be monitored, put onto computer and accessed on the internet. It's the idea of an inventive and rather lazy student who couldn't be bothered to walk down 7 flights of stairs to see if the pot in Cambridge University's computer block was full or empty.
With the BBC's Look East following in '98.
Now, if you thought watching paint dry was dull, then how about watching a coffee percolator do nothing at all?
Every day, 1,000 people log on to the internet to find out whether a coffee pot at Cambridge University is full or, well, not so full.
Highlighting a world where webcams were now starting to become common, showcasing everything from bus stops to the notorious JennyCam, the first web-based livecaster. In fact, it became a bit of a meme. Professor Philip Watson from the University of Texas decided to use the pictures from a single day to test MPEG encoding, whilst the Internet Engineering Task Force published an April Fool's Day RFC entitled Text Coffee Pot Control Protocol, outlining rules for coffee pots on the web, stating there is a strong, dark, rich requirement for a protocol designed expressly for the brewing of coffee. But whether it was local news or international, the coffee pot spread everywhere through TV, newspapers, and even an episode of the famous BBC4 radio show The Archers.
I remember the first webcam being set up. It was at Cambridge University, I think.
Oh, really?
They put a camera on their departmental coffee pot so people could check if it was full without leaving their desks. Just for a laugh, really.
Sounds a bit ridiculous to me.
Oh, absolutely. The point is that word got out.
And the ZD TV network.
Dr. Quentin Stafford-Fraser, welcome to Call for Help, Quentin.
Hi there.
This reached a climax in 2001 when the coffee pot and its live stream would meet its end. Well, temporarily, at least.
So we started this work in 1991, as I say, about the time the web started. And in 2000, 2001, somewhere around then, we knew we were going to be moving to this building. And this had always been the Trojan room coffee pot camera, and one thing that wasn't going to be around anymore was the Trojan room. And so we thought that as it had been running for about 10 years, it was probably time to decommission it. And we used to joke at the time about internet years being like dog years, that 7 years of normal time could be condensed into 1 year on the internet. And so this camera was 70 years old. It had had its 70 years and 10, and we thought it was probably about time to switch it off. The most publicity it ever got, actually, was when we decided to turn it off. This was about the time that other companies were thinking they were really trendy by announcing they had a website. And we said, we've done that, it's past. We turn it off after 10 years. And, but as a proof, in a way, of the fact that things happened really fast on the early internet, in 10 years, this had gone from being a real novelty to being an historic artifact. People had nostalgic feelings about it. They remembered the early days of the web. It was on the web for about 7 years, I guess. So it really hadn't been around long. But when we decided to switch it off, this became a big story. And in 1 week, I was quoted on the front page of the London Times and the Washington Post. I'll never do anything else that gets this kind of publicity. But it was an indication that this was well enough known that the Washington Post would put it on the front page. And it seems crazy now, but it was interesting that, yes, back then you could really get attention by turning off a website rather than starting one up. We used various different cameras at different times. I think this was the very first one, though, because if I look back at the early images we had, it's always got this one in it. So I think this was the first webcam. But what we did go through rather more were coffee pots, because the coffee pots weren't very well used and they didn't last very long. And over 10 years, they needed replacing fairly regularly. But the one I think that survived for the longest, and one of the other cameras, was bought in the end by Der Spiegel magazine in Germany, and lived in their office in Germany for quite a while. And they bought it on this new thing called eBay, and for, I think it was about $5,000, £3,500, yeah, which bought nice coffee machines and lots of coffee for the department. So the coffee got a lot better after we actually got rid of the coffee pot camera. And this is an historic artifact now, which is in a museum in Germany. So I have a feeling it was a Krupp's coffee machine, and that Krupp's themselves actually fixed it up. So that it's a German company, and they fixed it up so that it was working. I believe that's correct. So it actually went back to the manufacturers to get reinstated. So it wasn't necessarily the very first one, but it was the longest serving of the Trojan room coffee pots, yes.
And indeed it was a Krupp's coffee pot. To be precise, a Krupp's Pro Aroma 305 coffee pot, whose German engineering clearly made it better value for money than some of the earlier examples, including rival manufacturer Braun. Final news stories put the total number of visitors at some 2.4 million, with visitors around the world lamenting the end of this iconic corner of the web. This then is the final image of the coffee pot, showing the fingers of Daniel Gordon, Martin Johnson and Quentin Stafford-Fraser turning off the Acorn Archimedes, with coffee updates now on pause for the entire world. But interest did not wane. eBay, being founded in September 95, was already one of the biggest sites on the internet by 2001, with 22 million registered users, pushing some 79.4 million auctions per quarter. Perfect for selling off historic items of interest. So it was then, in August 2001, that the Krupp's coffee pot was listed, drawing huge attention. The Cambridge Coffee Club, as they came to be known, were expecting bids to not exceed £300. But as the 2:39 PM deadline loomed on the 11th of August, the final bid of £3,350 came through, equating to just under $5,000 at the time, or 10,500 marks. Holding on until the end, it was the German magazine Der Spiegel that came out victorious, thanks to sponsorship from the healthcare group Fresenius. Arriving on its floral tray with the UK plug cut off, the Krupp's machine, having been in near constant use since '97, at that point had a leaking water tank and was deemed a fire hazard. Spiegel described the metal tray as having millimetre-thick brown-black coffee stains. However, to sweeten the deal, Cambridge would also send their original coffee grinder, desk lamp and, of course, the Philips CCD camera being used at the time. They even sent the 19-inch rack that the machine and Acorn Archimedes were standing on during its final years. All of this kit then was used to set up the Trojan Room Coffee Museum, a very noughties online virtual experience where visitors could learn about the coffee machine's history, check out the coffee fun area, and even view the coffee pot in its new environment. Now with the added ability to change camera. Yeah, we had 2 webcams now that could be moved left and right. Der Spiegel only used the pot for a few months before it was transferred to a storage room and kept as an ever-streaming artifact of the early internet. People could log on and view the pot in complete comfort, knowing it was the one constant in their life, with the Der Spiegel building proudly illuminated in the background. Sometimes it would even have something inside the pot, like a rubber duck. Sometimes it was in pitch darkness, that old desk lamp seemingly no longer considered necessary. And sometimes it was dressed for the occasion or sponsorship deal. During this time, the coffee pot camera continued to pervade culture, even appearing as a reference in Hitman 2's Silent Assassin. Around the world, many other webcams came and went, including Toilet Cam, Ken's Freezer Cam, and Feet Cam. Calm yourself down. Whilst the coffee pot, and indeed the ever-charismatic Quentin, appeared in further news stories, including when the BBC looked back on the first 20 years of the web.
I love the way in which it was developed for the most practical and necessary of reasons. Just explain, we've got some pictures too.
It was a very fundamental and important human motivation which drove us to this, and that was caffeine. And when you're on breakfast TV, you appreciate this even more.
The coffee pot and its stories seemed like it would be around forever, but by the 30th of June 2016, it was gone. The Der Spiegel page still existed, but the feed did not. That one constant, the coffee pot, was no more. It had left us, just like everyone else. We should never have trusted it. But it's okay, because it just ended up here. Proudly donated to the Heinz Nixdorf Museum's forum and on display since October 2016. Situated on the second floor, away from the museum's coffee shop at the entrance, and among other artifacts in the illuminated internet wall, including a telecom view data terminal, an old PC and modem, some old mobile phones, and a Nextcube, and even some cabling. As you approach the coffee pot, it illuminates for all to see, with a nearby display that talks about its history and provides early images from the Cambridge webcam. It even provides a QR code so that you can see the currently hooked webcam in action, although for some reason it wasn't actually working when we were there. But fear not, because by simply typing in this address, you can return to the comfort, security and stability of the coffee pot whenever you like. And as long as it's working, you can once again be at peace, now in full colour, full motion video. It's somewhat ironic, but it was very likely more stable in the 90s than it is today. Which leaves one thing for us to do. Return to the room where it all started. A room which now, well, it's literally a coffee room for students and staff to hang out in. It has a kitchen and a set of automated coffee machines, but rather fittingly, in the corner we found this. A single, lone, old-style coffee machine which perhaps is a small tribute to what came before. Or more likely just a coffee machine for those who like to drink by the pot. Until next time, I've been Nostalgia Nerd. Toodaloo. Patreon subscribers, you can access the vlogs of both the museum and the Cambridge Computer Lab along with a full unedited interview with Quentin right now. As ever, thanks for watching and thanks for your support.
I must go and log on right now. Ivor, we have